So until this weekend, our next talk would have been Steve Ghan. Steve and his wife were hiking in a wilderness area this weekend, and unfortunately his wife injured her ankle, and she's in the hospital getting it repaired. And so Rob Wood, who has kindly agreed to present Steve's talk, and then we'll hear from Rob again later with his own talk. But Rob, thank you.
Thank you. So on behalf of Steve, I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me, him. And it's sad that he couldn't make it, but it's hopefully I can do some justice. I only got these slides yesterday, so I have seen a little bit of this work before, so let's see how we go. Essentially, what Steve has been doing here is trying to understand the chain of events, if you like, that go from aerosol emissions all the way to radiative forcing. And instead, when we look at the CMIP, as Ken showed, the CMIP 5 range of uncertainty, that lumps in all these different chain of events, all these different events that go from emissions, all the processes that change the aerosol into the accumulation mode, or the gases. Most of the emissions, anthropogenic emissions at least, are in the form of gases. As we move forward, those droplets have to be those aerosol have to be activated into cloud droplets. The cloud droplets may respond in the macrophysical sense. The liquid water path could change, etc. So there's a lot of different pieces to this puzzle, and what he's trying to do in this study, which is being done with Ming-Wai Wang and now at Nanjing University, is to break these apart in different models, across different models, as I'll try to illustrate. So the key question here, why has it been so difficult to make progress, and what can be done to make progress moving forward, and hopefully some of what we'll show here will illustrate some of these things. Essentially what is being done in this study is linking, is there a pointer? Okay. Linking the radiative forcing, basically caused by aerosols, or the aerosol indirect effect, and this is, I should state, is only the warm cloud problem here. So we're only looking at liquid clouds. But he's breaking this down into various factors, what he calls factors, that start from the emissions. So to get an anthropogenic aerosol indirect effect, you need to start with some change in the emissions. So anthropogenic emissions. Here, all these are expressed in terms of these delta logs, just fractional changes in various things. So if you have some change in emissions, those emissions, and these emissions are largely, as I said, in the form of gases, SO2, other anthropogenic emissions, those emissions have to then go on and change the CCN if we're going to change the liquid cloud properties through the Toomey effect and through the Albrecht effect. Oops, I think my pointer's run out. Is there any other way to... it comes back. Oops. So the emissions have to change the CCN. The CCN then have to change the cloud droplet concentration. That's the process that Thanos focused on quite a lot in his talk. And then the droplet concentration has to affect the optical thickness of the clouds. And the optical thickness of the clouds then affects the radiative, the radiative properties of the clouds. And then all these changes have to project onto the initial state. So that's the pre-industrial state of the radiative, the cloud forcing, if you like, in the pre-industrial state, to produce the change that we got from the pre-industrial to the present day. And what he's doing in this study is actually looking at all of these terms separately to understand where is the spread that starts here and results in the aerosol indirect effect. Where is it coming from? Which of these terms is producing a lot of model spread? Where are the model spread in these? And which ones are maybe more uncertain and which ones are less uncertain? You can further break down the optical depth response to a cloud droplet concentration. This was really Toomey's sort of insight, I think, was putting together the radiative transfer with the microphysics here. So we know the Toomey effect, you can break this down into the Toomey effect. So here we've got this term in the green square. You can break it down into a Toomey effect, which is essentially a constant liquid water path. How does the optical depth change in response to RE, and how does the RE change, the effective radius change in response to the cloud droplet concentration? That was really Toomey's great insight was to formulate that. And then, but also we now know that the cloud macrophysical properties, the cloud the cloud liquid water path, the cloud fraction can also change. So this is encompassed here by the grid box mean cloud liquid water path, which folds in both cloud. I wouldn't probably want to do it this way, but I would want to sort of break out another term which has the cloud fraction in it. But this liquid water path is the grid box average, so it contains both the cloud fraction response and the liquid water path response. And so you can think of this as the lifetime effects. These are the lifetime effects, and these are the albedo effects. So again, you can break some of these terms even down into further smaller pieces. And this is what is basically doing this as I think it's an Aerocom project, and so there are a variety of different models. Some are so the same model base, but with different choices for the parameterizations. For example, CLUB is a turbulence parameterization. MG2 is a particular new updated microphysics parameterization. These are different models, CAM6, Sprintars, PNNL version of CAM, various versions of these of different models. And here, what we're showing, each of these ticks marks out one of these terms that I showed in the previous slide in the top here. So we've got the change in top of atmosphere. So this is the model spread. This is what we see essentially, not quite the same, but it's pretty much what we see in the CMIP in the results that Ken showed. This is the spread in the model responses since pre-industrial to present day. And this is, the way he's done it here is so they can show them all on the same graph. He's normalized the results so that they all cluster around 1. Don't want to get into, I don't really understand exactly how he's done this normalization. But basically, this is the overall spread that we get, the delta R. And then, as you might expect, because most models, you can't really run them too far out of equilibrium, radiative equilibrium at the top of atmosphere, there's not a great deal of spread coming from just the R, which is the pre-industrial top of atmosphere cloud radiative forcing. So that doesn't contribute a great deal. On the other hand, though, all these other terms which reflect the responses of various parts of this, various pieces in this chain, all have a large spread. So what we mean by that is that there's a large diversity across, as we go across any one of these ticks, there's a large spread. Apart from, which is quite interesting here, the emissions are fixed in these simulations, so every model is running the same emissions, but the CCN response, ironically, so this is the change in CCN that you get as a result of those changed emissions. Actually, there's not that much of a spread from that. So despite the massive amounts of differences in how the aerosol processes are, well, maybe the models actually do rather similar things, but you might imagine that the CCNs you would get from just having lots of different, each model having different aerosol processes would actually contribute a significant amount of uncertainty, but it doesn't seem to in this case. So by doing this, we can start to pull apart which of the models have stronger sensitivity of one of these particular factors and which have weaker sensitivity. And you can break this down by land and ocean. I'm not really going to talk specifically about that. Oh, and this was basically saying that the values are normalized by the multi-model mean in this case. You can then break down just the part that's related to essentially the cloud optical thickness response to the cloud droplet concentration. So this is very much a cloud problem. It's fundamentally not really related to aerosol itself because you've already done the process by which the aerosols are doing the activation. You're looking at then how the optical thickness of the clouds changes in response to droplet concentration. And there's a spread in the overall, this is the overall term, and then you can break it down into these two separate terms, the Toomey effect, you can call it that, the Toomey effect and the lifetime effects. And you see that there's actually quite a lot of similarity across a lot of the models, but then there's often an outlier model. In this case, the Sprintars model is quite a lot lower in its sensitivity, and it's mainly due to having almost a zero liquid water path response to changes in droplet concentration. Other models show much higher responses. But you can basically use this tool to then understand, we can see not just whether a model has a stronger aerosol indirect effect, but what processes in that model, or at least what components of the responses are responsible for differences between intermodal spreads. You can then, this is quite common. I mean, I think Ken or maybe Thanos also showed a plot similar to this. This is just the change in the CCN. The mean across all the models showing you where the anthropogenic CCN are coming from. The East Asia, Eastern Europe, the United States are the classic places. And you can also look at the spread across the different models. But then you can also, more interestingly, more novelly, compare the average slopes of these. So I should also stress that the way in which these are done, which is interesting, is that this delta log ND, you might be wondering, how are you getting this number for the previous charts here, for example? I should stress that these reflect global average values. So they're really not kind of regressions here. They're global. For each model, you calculate a global average change in optical depth. You can calculate a global average change in RE. So there's also some problems here with the internal, the internal variability in the system. Also, it may mean that some of these relationships will be different if you do the averaging a little bit differently. Anyway, back to this. This is the droplet number sensitivity to CCN. In Steve's notes, he comments how quite similar this is across the globe. I don't know. You could look at it that way. You could also say, well, the droplet sensitivity over oceans to CCN number concentration. Bear in mind that in regions where there's no anthropogenic pollution, these numbers are not going to be very meaningful, right? Because it's going to be hard to get, derivatives that the denominator of the derivative is going to be highly uncertain and small. So concentrating on more where the anthropogenic pollution is, you find that the greatest sensitivities are over ocean. I think we sort of understand that. I mean, the observational in situ aircraft results will show similar results to that. Smaller values, the sort of greener values over, so this would be some people call this the ACI index, which is between 0.5 and 1 over oceans, and then is considerably lower in polluted regions downwind. Well, it's really only this polluted region, which is kind of interesting. I wonder if something's gone a bit crazy here. But so anyway, but he remarks on how uniform it is. But you can look and you can see how spread it is across the models. And you can look to see where in some regions there's relatively small spread in this slope, and in other regions there's larger spread. So you can start to look at the different behaviors of the different components across the models. And he's just starting to get into this. It's relatively new work. I don't think it's yet been published. And then you can also do that for the cloud optical depth sensitivity to the cloud droplet number. And I'm going to skip those because... So then he's asking, can we... This was a study done by Joyce Penner. She's here, I think. Well, no. Where she was asking the question, can we use present day, because that's all we have in terms of observations, how can we use present day variability in the system to understand the sensitivity, in this case, of the cloud droplet concentration to the AOD? These are the observable parameters that we have. They're maybe not the optimal ones, but they're globally observable. And then looked at regressions in the present day, that's the red line, and regressions of AOD against droplet concentration in the pre-industrial, finding different slopes for each of those. So, which means that if we happen to be in the pre-industrial and wanted to project forward, well, there's going to be this huge industrialization, what's it going to do to the top of atmosphere radiation? We would get different answers from if we did that in the present day, which is what we're doing. But moreover, what's also important is if you take the means, which is what Steve's doing, the means AOD for the present day and the pre-industrial, and look at the actual difference from the present day to the pre-industrial, that has a different slope again. So again, it's sort of illustrating that it's complex to infer forcing from present day or pre-industrial aerosol measurements alone, variability alone. So he's put this slide up to illustrate that this was done with one model, so he's going to do the same thing essentially with a variety of models here. So this is essentially the same. What he's showing here are essentially the slopes using the present day versus the slope using the present day mean minus the pre-industrial. So it's essentially the same result, but with a variety of models. And this is showing the present day, and this is showing the pre-industrial minus the present day, and showing that there's a reasonably good correlation between these two. And moreover, the sensitivity derived from the present day, in many cases, is quite close to that from the pre-industrial minus the present day. It'd be interesting to see further where you could do this globally. Where's the best places to make this observation globally? He's done this just as a global average, but you could do this by season, you can do this by region. But it gives us some hope, although there are models that are, and in regions that are way out. But it sort of gives us some hope. You can further do this for what I sort of kind of would have expected this. When you start to do this for the cloud responses to the changed microphysics, you find that really goes away. That ability, that you've got almost no skill. I mean, the difference present day minus pre-industrial, there's a spread in here, but it doesn't correlate at all with the present day. That's like saying, you know, can I measure a change in optical thickness in a cloud and attribute it simply to the aerosol, or rather to the droplet concentration? Well, nobody would want to do that. People would say, well, doesn't the cloud thickness matter? Doesn't the cloud liquid water path matter? Well, of course, it does. And it might not matter if there was no correlation between the macrophysical cloud property, the liquid water path, and the droplet concentration, in which case you get a lot of noise, but it wouldn't really matter. But there's probably systematic correlations between liquid water path and droplet concentration. Actually, this afternoon I'll talk about why there might be some of those. And some of this may come about because of aerosol processes. Some of it may come about simply because meteorology controls both liquid water path and ND. So in regions close to coastlines in the subtropics, you have relatively thin clouds and you have high concentrations of drops. Don't know whether they're really connected or not. And further offshore, you have higher liquid water paths and lower droplet concentrations. Well, when you're just observing tau and trying to attribute it to one of those variables, of course, you're going to run into problems. And so what this is showing is that that's really a real challenge to do that. So at the very least, you would have to probably try and come up with a variable that linked tau to ND that controlled for some other variable like liquid water path. And maybe you can do a better result there. The same thing's true. I think this is more or less the same result because this is showing how does liquid water path change with ND. And again, it's the same result. You can't really trust the present day measurements to give you any insights into pre-industrial minus the present day behavior. So what can be done to make progress moving forward? And of course, what Steve is arguing here is we need to develop better metrics that actually are able to use present day variability to constrain the pre-industrial minus the present day. That's a complex problem. Or another alternative is to use measurements where aerosol has changed over time. And I think a relatively successful, a very successful example of the first one of these is to use, is where Mingwei Wang in a paper in 2012 in GRL actually showed the liquid water path change from the present day minus the pre-industrial. And so this is how the liquid water path has changed in response to CCN from the present day minus the pre-industrial simulation can actually be related. So it's really this is really the lifetime effect in the model, if you want to call it a lifetime effect, second indirect effect, found that it correlated quite well, very well actually, across different model versions here, different models. Mingwei found that across a variety of different models, mainly which were tweaks in terms of microphysical parameterizations of one model, you got a very good correlation between this parameter and the susceptibility of the frequency of precipitation, which is called probability of precipitation, how susceptible that is to changes in AI, aerosol index, because that's an observable, in the present day, found that this present day metric could actually correlate very well with the change. So in the present day, if precipitation is in models where precipitation is very strongly dependent, suppressed by by increasing aerosols, found that those are the models where you get strong changes, strong increases in liquid water path as a response to increasing aerosol concentrations. Finds that actually relationship that held really mainly across one model, there are a couple of other models in here, actually matches quite well with this larger ensemble of models. So this seems to be a robust metric. An issue here, I would say, is the use of observations, which is this line here, which really only gives us, it doesn't tell us the past, it only can give us an insight into the present day. Here, the argument was in the Ming-Wai paper that this was a very low number in observations. And these observations come from a cloud sat combined with aerosol measurements, aerosol index measurements. And the argument was, well, if we just track this down, if we say, well, what's the best guess here? Well, it's kind of zero. So people like Bjorn, I think Chris Brotherson's going to talk about this, people like Bjorn Siemens, not necessarily just in response to this, basically said, well, maybe there is no liquid water path response, maybe we don't even need to bother modeling it. It's just the Toomey effect. But I would argue that actually I've made measurements of S-pop in a different way, slightly different way from this, which don't use AI, but use actual measured CCN underneath the clouds. Actually, we get S-pops are way higher. So this is a sort of cautionary tale about the way in which we process and interpret the observations is often also leads to large amounts of uncertainty in estimates. So don't always trust the observations. The jury's out. I don't know which one of those is right, the way we did it, or the way, I think this was by Tristan Lecuyer. There's different ways to approach this problem, whether or not you use the globally available measurements or whether you look in just regions where you've got better measurements to be able to constrain some of these precipitation susceptibilities. So the second way that Steve was talking about where we can move forward is by using time changes, which are relatively rapid. So if you look at how quickly the European emissions, this is the emissions of SO2, I think, have changed since the 1970s. They've dropped precipitously because of Clean Air Acts and the like in Europe. And in East Asians, rapid industrialization has resulted in very large increases in the same way that those happened in the West earlier. We can maybe leverage these time changes to understand time changes in emissions to understand time changes in cloud properties and therefore infer aerosol indirect effects. One way you can do this, and this is, I'm not all that familiar with this study, but is to use global dimming, global brightening. So in response to this European reduction of emissions, the skies got brighter, what we call global brightening over Central Europe. And because Central Europe has a very good radiometer network, it's reliable, you can constrain these trends. These are now time trends or time differences between the present day and the earliest you could make these decent measurements was 1990, showing that over Central Europe, the solar brightening has resulted in I guess this is 15 years, so maybe 4 watts per meter square per decade, so maybe a total of 6 watts. It's measurable with ground-based radiometers. And then you can overlay that, so this is, again, similar to the S-pop we showed earlier. This is now the observational constraint. And then the models, well, depends if you can throw that one out. But if you don't throw that one out, if you do throw that one out, you can sort of believe there's a robust relationship between this solar brightening over Europe, which is immeasurable, and essentially the global aerosol response. So models that have strong brightening here have pre-industrial to present day strong aerosol indirect effects because you had stronger you had stronger aerosol loadings before the cleanup began. So you get a relationship which, if you can throw that one out, then you can maybe constrain the global aerosol indirect effects using this method. So it's an idea. There's some evidence here that might work, but it's a potential pathway forward is to use these time changes. So we might not be able to use the European time changes in a satellite world because we didn't have a lot of the modern satellites at that time, but we could certainly try to do that with Asia as it ramps up its emissions. So, that's just what I said. So, in conclusion, so the diversity in estimated radiative forcing through aerosol effects on clouds is driven by a number of different factors. Sensitivity of cloud droplet number to CCN, the thing that Thanos spent a lot of time talking about, which we know is an important part of the component of these models. And then the sensitivity of a liquid water path to droplet number is also extremely important. So we need constraints on these anthropogenic effects. I'd say constraining sensitivity using data from present day variability is not sufficient, although I thought he was saying the opposite in the Ming-Wai I think the Ming-Wai study was sort of arguing that you could use the present day, but maybe the overall forcing it can't be done that way. But you can certainly try to find metrics that are that can constrain the anthropogenic aerosol effects. Regional trends, I was trying to argue that looking at specific regions, looking at susceptibility in particular regions and try and bring all the models in on a regional analysis could be very helpful. So that we're doing that as part of the ACPC project now, which is under ILEAPS and GUX. And so global satellite data here limits, he's thinking really the MODIS era, although there is going backwards, there are the AVHRR, microphysical data, which include aerosols, although the uncertainties are much larger. So post-2002, we're going to have to do something different, or look at a different regime change. So maybe looking at the East Asian rise of pollution. And people are starting to, there are several studies being done to look at that. I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.